Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're uncovering one of the most astonishing pivots in modern history. We're going to see exactly how a simple trading company managed to execute a literal corporate takeover of an entire subcontinent. You know, we usually think of conquests in terms of vast empires and powerful kings, but today, we're looking at a boardroom that transformed into an empire.
So let's dive right in by asking ourselves the ultimate question. How did the British East India Company pull off this massive geopolitical shift? Seriously, how do you go from trading spices and textiles to commanding armies and collecting taxes from millions of people? It certainly didn't happen overnight, but it did happen remarkably fast. And the turning point boils down to a very specific chain of events that culminated in a single, definitive military clash.
There's this brilliant quote by historian S.N. Sen that perfectly frames our whole story. It really shows the critical difference between just getting your foot in the door and completely taking over the house. In this explainer, we're focusing heavily on that second part, the Battle of Buxar, and the intense buildup that actually caused it. Plassey might have handed the British the keys, but it was Buxar that decisively, violently kicked the door wide open.
Section 1. The Prize of Bengal, the boardroom coup of 1757.
Now, to understand the brutal showdown at Buxar, we first need to look at the immense wealth of Bengal and the boardroom-style coup that occurred just a few years prior. Bengal was an absolute economic powerhouse. We are talking about incredibly high agricultural production, specifically rice, and a phenomenal water transport system for moving all those goods around. By the mid-1700s, it was India's top producer of silk and cotton textiles. But crucially, it was also a massive supplier of saltpeter. If you wanted to make gunpowder in Europe, you absolutely needed Bengal. So controlling Bengal literally meant controlling a vast, globally significant supply chain.
You know, the 1757 Battle of Plassey wasn't really a military victory at all. In fact, it was practically won before it was even fought. It was essentially a transaction of betrayal and bribery. The company's Robert Clive orchestrated a massive conspiracy with the Nawab's own commander, Mir Jafar, and some rich local bankers. They literally bought off the army, won the so-called battle in just 11 hours with minimal casualties, and installed Mir Jafar as a puppet ruler. This created a sponsored state that was controlled entirely by the company.
Section 2. From Puppet to Rebel, the Catalyst for War.
And this brings us directly to the catalyst for the actual war. The crucial point here is the misuse of something called dostocks. By 1760, the company had replaced Mir Jafar with a new Nawab, Mir Qasim. Now, Mir Qasim was actually a highly competent administrator. He very quickly realized the British were ruthlessly exploiting these dostocks, which were basically free trade passes. British officials were misusing them not just for company business, but for their own private individual side hustles. Think of them as massive corporate tax loopholes. This actively drove local native businesses into destitution because Indian merchants simply couldn't compete with tax-free British goods. It caused a catastrophic decline in the Nawab's revenue.
Acting as a true reformer, Mir Qasim pushed back hard against this corporate monopoly with some incredible counter-moves. To stop the British from having this unfair advantage, he radically abolished all internal duties. He completely leveled the playing field for Indian traders. He also shifted his capital from Murshidabad to Mungir, just to put some physical distance between himself and the British influence. On top of that, he began staffing his bureaucracy with his own fiercely loyal people. He was actively asserting his independence, and the East India Company absolutely hated it.
Look at how rapidly these tensions escalated. You have the initial corporate takeover at Plassey in 1757. Then Mir Qasim takes the throne in 1760 and starts making his reforms. Within just 4 years of his rule, the commercial rivalry becomes so toxic and unmanageable that it explodes into a full-blown military conflict by 1764. That is just 7 years to go from a boardroom coup to an all-out war for the subcontinent.
Section 3. The Grand Triple Alliance, uniting against the monopoly.
Faced with this overwhelming British dominance, Mir Qasim realized a terrifying truth. There was no way he could fight this corporate war machine alone. Forced out of Bengal, he strategically formed a massive coalition. He aligned with Shuja-ud-Daula, the very powerful Nawab of Awadh, a neighboring state. But his real masterstroke was bringing in Shah Alam II, the Mughal emperor himself. Even though the emperor was technically a fugitive at the time, his name still carried immense, legitimate weight all across India. This was a formidable, united front against the British.
Our sources point out something really fascinating right here. They call this a war of circumstances rather than intentions. The East India Company didn't necessarily set out in 1764 with a grand, premeditated master plan to conquer northern India. And the Indian rulers didn't initially want to risk their kingdoms either. This resulting conflict was a violent breaking point born entirely out of commercial rivalry. The greed over those dostocks, those trade passes, just pushed everyone way past the point of no return.
Which brings us to Section 4, the Battle of Buxar, October 22, 1764.
And here is the climax of our explainer. Consider the sheer scale of the mismatch on this battlefield. On one side, you have the East India Company forces commanded by Major Hector Munro, standing at roughly 7,000 men. On the other side, the Grand Triple Alliance, fielding anywhere between 40,000 to 60,000 troops. Looking at these numbers, you'd think this was a guaranteed, slam-dunk win for the massive native alliance, right? But the highly disciplined company forces were about to absolutely shock the subcontinent. Despite that massive numerical disadvantage, this was no Plassey. There was no secret backdoor deal here. This was real, brutal warfare. Major Hector Munro commanded a highly disciplined force. He utilized superior British artillery fire, incredibly strict infantry formations, and cohesive tactics to break the chaotic, uncoordinated charges of the massive native alliance. In the end, the heavily outnumbered British decisively decimated the Triple Alliance. The victory was absolute, and it firmly ended native resistance in eastern India.
The contrast between these two historical turning points is absolutely staggering, and it's honestly the most important takeaway from our sources today. Plassey was a transaction of betrayal. It was bought with banknotes, lasted barely half a day, and was basically a political coup. Buxar, on the other hand, was a full-blown war born of economic circumstances. It featured heavy casualties and ended as a decisive, hard-fought military triumph. Plassey showed the company's cunning, but Buxar proved their terrifying military might.
Finally, Section 5, the fate of India, the aftermath of Buxar. The consequences of this single day of fighting essentially sealed the fate of the entire Indian subcontinent for the next 2 centuries. The British transformed overnight from kingmakers into the absolute masters of the region. They didn't just win a battle, they legally won the right to tax the people. They gained the Diwani, the revenue rights of Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa. The once powerful Nawab of Oudh was placed entirely at their mercy, and the Mughal emperor, the theoretical ruler of all India, was reduced to a mere pensioner, living on a monthly stipend provided by a British corporation.
To manage their shiny new prize, the British ruthlessly engineered what is known as the dual system of administration. This meant the company held all the real power and collected all the revenue, but they took absolutely zero responsibility for the welfare of the people or the administration of justice. Meanwhile, the local puppet Nawab held all the responsibility for governing, but had absolutely no power or money to actually do it. It was the ultimate perfect corporate extraction model.
As our sources emphatically note in this really powerful summary quote, Battle of Plassey decided the fate of Bengal, while Battle of Buxar decided the fate of India. This was the exact precise moment the East India Company went from being just a powerful factor in Bengal politics to the paramount power in all of North India. The land stretching from Bengal all the way up to Allahabad now lay right at their feet, and the roads directly to Delhi were wide open.
As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with this provocative thought. What actually happens to a nation when a corporation literally becomes its government? The events leading up to and including the Battle of Buxar show us the ultimate, devastating cost of unchecked corporate expansion and monopoly. It's a piece of history that really forces us to look differently at the intersection of business and state power. Thanks for learning with me today, and keep questioning the history behind the world we live in.